The narrative of Ricky Gervais is often framed by the explosive success of The Office, but the true architecture of his life was drafted in a cramped, radiator-starved flat in King's Cross during the early 1980s. Long before the world knew him as a biting satirist, he was a philosophy student at University College London, navigating the existential fog of post-grad life alongside Jane Fallon. Their meeting wasn't a cinematic explosion of destiny. It was a quiet convergence of two minds that prioritized autonomy over convention. In those early years, survival was the only metric of success. They lived in a singular room where the boundary between the kitchen and the bedroom was purely theoretical, and the luxury of privacy was sacrificed for the necessity of rent. This period was crucial because it stripped away the performative layers of romance. Without money, status, or a clear path forward, all they had was the raw intellectual and emotional compatibility of two people who actually liked each other. This wasn't a rehearsal for a grander life. It was a lived reality where the absence of traditional milestones, like engagement rings or wedding planning, went entirely unnoticed because they were too busy figuring out how to exist in a world that hadn't yet invited them in. At this stage of his life, Ricky was drifting through the fringes of the entertainment industry, experimenting with new wave pop and local radio, while Jane was methodically climbing the ladder of television production. There was a distinct lack of life scripting between them. Most couples use the early 20s to construct a shared fantasy of what adulthood should look like, often revolving around the acquisition of titles: husband, wife, parent. For Ricky and Jane, those titles felt like unnecessary luggage. They were operating on a frequency of radical honesty that preceded the fame that would later make such honesty a brand. They didn't need a contract to prove they were a unit because the daily struggle of sharing a tiny space and a dwindling bank account provided all the evidence required. The grit of London in the 80s acted as a forge, hardening their bond into something that didn't require the scaffolding of societal approval. By the time they reached their 30s, they had already bypassed the standard checkpoints of adulthood, not out of a desire to be rebellious, but because those checkpoints felt irrelevant to the specific, private language they had developed between themselves, a language rooted in humor and a shared skepticism of the done thing. The philosophical underpinnings of Ricky's worldview began to solidify during these lean years, long before he had a platform to broadcast them. Having studied philosophy, he was naturally inclined to deconstruct the why behind human behavior. When he looked at the institution of marriage, he didn't see a romantic ideal. He saw a social construct designed for property rights and religious oversight, two things he found increasingly meaningless. Jane mirrored this pragmatism. Her focus was on her career and her own internal sense of stability, which didn't rely on a legal change of surname. They were building a partnership that was entirely voluntary, renewed every morning by the simple act of staying. This lack of formality wasn't a fear of commitment, a phrase often hurled at them by traditionalists. On the contrary, it was an elevated form of commitment. To stay with someone when there is no legal barrier to leaving is a much more profound statement of intent than staying because a court or a church says you must. This realization wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was the quiet, steady heartbeat of their relationship. They were two individuals who refused to become a single entity for the sake of appearances, choosing instead to remain two separate people walking the same path by choice. F. The skepticism Ricky Gervais holds toward marriage is inextricably linked to his journey into atheism, a transition that occurred with startling clarity during his teenage years. He famously recounts asking his mother about the suffering of children, only to be met with a directive to remain silent and faithful. For a mind wired for logic, that answer was the catalyst for a total dismantling of religious belief. As he matured, this atheism evolved from a rejection of a deity into a broader rejection of all rituals that lacked a rational basis. To Ricky, the wedding ceremony is the ultimate performance of faking it, a series of vows made to a vacuum, witnessed by people whose presence has no bearing on the actual health of the relationship. He viewed the pomp and circumstance of weddings as a distraction from the reality of partnership. In his eyes, if the love is real, the ceremony is redundant. If the love is failing, the ceremony is a lie. This precision in thought meant that by the time he and Jane were in a position to afford a massive wedding, the very idea of it felt like a betrayal of the intellectual honesty they had cultivated in their poverty-stricken youth. Jane Fallon's perspective on family and motherhood is equally grounded in a self-awareness that society often interprets as coldness, though it is actually a form of deep empathy. Jane has been open about her decision not to have children, framing it not as a sacrifice for her career, but as an honest assessment of her own temperament. She recognized her tendency toward anxiety and her protective instincts, realizing that she might struggle with the letting go phase of parenting. Rather than succumbing to the biological or social pressure to reproduce, she chose a path that allowed her to be a present, loving figure in the lives of her nieces and nephews without the weight of primary ownership. This choice was never a point of contention with Ricky, because he shared a similar lack of the paternal itch. They reached a consensus that their lives were full and complete as they were. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth they present to the public, the idea that a duo can be a whole family. Society is conditioned to view childless couples as waiting for life to begin or missing out on the ultimate human experience. But Ricky and Jane represent the radical notion that contentment is found in knowing your limits and honoring them. As Ricky's career moved from the underground success of The Office to the global stage of the Golden Globes, his refusal to play the game became his defining characteristic. This translated directly into how he handled inquiries about his personal life. He became the man who would tell the world's biggest stars that their opinions were worthless, and then go home to the same woman he'd been with since he was a broke student. There is a delicious irony in the fact that one of the most subversive men in Hollywood has one of the most stable and boring domestic lives in the industry, while his peers were navigating high-profile divorces, prenuptial agreements, and custody battles. Ricky and Jane remained an island of consistency. Their lack of a marriage certificate became a shield against the very scandals that plagued traditional celebrity unions. They had nothing to divide in a legal sense because they had already shared everything in a moral sense. This part of their story highlights a profound psychological truth. Those who feel the need to loudly proclaim their commitment through ritual are often the ones most insecure about its longevity. Ricky and Jane felt no such insecurity. L. At the age of 64, Ricky Gervais occupies a unique space in the cultural consciousness. He is the elder statesman of the no-nonsense movement, a man who has made a fortune by pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. But the most powerful statement he has ever made isn't a joke about a celebrity or a tweet about religion. It is the 4-decade-long silence of his enduring relationship. By simply existing as a happy, unmarried, childless couple, he and Jane Fallon provide a living counter-narrative to the life script that most people follow without question. They have reached a stage where the world has finally stopped asking when and started asking how. How did they survive the transition from sharing a one-room flat to owning multiple mansions? How did they stay grounded when the entire world was screaming Ricky's name? The answer lies in the fact that they never allowed their internal value system to be edited by outside observers. They didn't get married when they were poor because it was impractical, and they didn't get married when they were rich because it was unnecessary. The human touch in their story is found in the small, mundane details of their life together: the shared love for their pets, the quiet evenings, the mutual respect for each other's creative work. Jane transitioned from a high-powered TV producer to a best-selling novelist, a career shift that Ricky supported not as a husband, but as a partner who recognizes her individual brilliance. There is no sense of competition between them, only a shared amusement at the absurdity of the world they now inhabit. Their story challenges the viewer to look at their own lives and ask which of their traditions are choices and which are merely habits. Ricky's journey suggests that true freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want, but the courage to not do what everyone expects. In a world obsessed with content and branding, their relationship is the one thing they have kept largely for themselves. It is the one part of Ricky's life that isn't for sale, isn't a punchline, and isn't up for debate. This boundaries-first approach to life is what has allowed them to remain sane in an industry designed to cultivate madness. Ultimately, the reason people have finally started listening, instead of asking, is that time has proven Ricky right. A marriage that lasts 40 years is a success by any standard, but a partnership that lasts 40 years without a legal mandate is a miracle of modern logic. It proves that the glue of a relationship isn't a ceremony, a ring, or a piece of paper. It's the quality of the conversation and the depth of the mutual respect. As we look at the legacy of Ricky Gervais, we see more than just a comedian. We see a man who lived his philosophy to the letter. He told us that God wasn't watching, that fame was an illusion, and that grief was the price we pay for love. By standing next to Jane Fallon for nearly half a century without ever feeling the need to prove it to the state, he showed us that the most profound truths are often the ones we don't feel the need to shout. Their life together is a quiet masterpiece of nonconformity, a reminder that the best way to live is to figure out what you believe, find someone who believes it too, and then ignore everyone else until they eventually stop talking.